an entity, started to suffer quite badly. And I think in the middle...
They called him Slow Hand, but Eric Clapton's temper has anything but a slow burn. Behind the smooth licks and timeless ballads lies a man notorious not only for reshaping blues rock, but for clashing with some of the biggest names in music history. Eric Clapton's temper is not a slow burn behind the smooth licks, and not only is he famous for blues rock, but he also had fights with some of the biggest names in music history. These weren't just creative disagreements, they were deep-seated feuds caused by jealousy, ego, betrayal, and even outright hatred from former lovers. They went from public insults and backstage meltdowns to lifelong grudges. Some say that as the rivalries got worse, Clapton's quiet anger became the undercurrent of rock's golden age. It all started with a fight that turned a studio session into a battlefield. The pop puppet master, Phil Collins, tried to change Eric Clapton's image as a bluesman. In the glossy synth-driven haze of the mid-1980s, Collins tried to change Clapton's image, and it almost broke them up. On the surface, their collaboration looked good. Collins, who was at the height of his fame with Genesis and a soaring solo career, came on board to produce tracks for Clapton's 1985 album Behind the Sun. He even played drums on a few tracks, adding his signature studio polish for the record label. It was a match made in marketing heaven, but for Clapton, it was a personal and creative crisis. The smooth production, bright keyboards, and radio-friendly mixes didn't go with Clapton's soulful music. He felt like a stranger on his own record. He reportedly raged to a friend behind closed doors, saying, "I felt like I was being packaged. That's not who I am, never was." Tensions rose as Collins, ever the hitmaker, pushed for catchy arrangements that would make it to the top of the pop charts, while Clapton, still rooted in his blues roots, resisted every move. The two fought constantly in the studio, with Collins pushing for a wider audience and Clapton fearing he was selling out. Behind the scenes of Live Aid, the huge concert in 1985 that millions of people watched live, Clapton and Collins seemed to be on the same page. However, there was a bitter fight over the set list, with Clapton wanting deep blues cuts that were raw and emotional and Collins insisting on polished tracks that would dazzle the global audience watching on TV. The pressure to conform was crushing, and Clapton would later bitterly reflect on this time, calling it a time when he sold his soul for chart success while Collins rode the pop wave to greater fame. Clapton quietly pulled away from the spotlight to rediscover the music that made him famous in the first place. Their relationship never got better. The album was criticized for being too produced, and many fans and blues purists said Clapton had lost his soul. He would remember the whole thing badly for years to come. But if you thought the tension over musical identity was bad, wait until you see what happens when Clapton is stuck in a band with someone he can't even look in the eye. Ginger Baker is the worst drummer in the world. Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker were on fire on stage, but behind the scenes, they were slowly falling apart. As two-thirds of the legendary supergroup Cream, they created a sound that defined late 1960s rock, gritty, loud, and electric. Their performances were explosive, but so were their egos, and their fights were just as famous as their solos. From the start, their relationship was unstable. Clapton liked Baker's drumming, but he didn't like Baker as a person. Baker, on the other hand, thought Clapton was weak-willed and too willing to give in to business pressures. Things quickly got worse. Before a big show, Clapton told a crew member, "Either he goes or I go." That wasn't just idle talk, he was ready to leave. By the time Cream started their farewell tour in 1968, the relationship between Clapton and Baker was so bad that they couldn't even be in the same room. Some sessions were recorded in completely different studios to keep them from fighting. Even when they were on stage, they were angry and rude to each other. There were icy silences during breaks and glares during performances, but the band kept going. In a strange way, their anger may have been part of what made their music so powerful. Songs like White Room and Sunshine of Your Love had a tense, electric edge that few bands could match. But when Cream finally broke up, Clapton wanted nothing more to do with Baker. Fans had been hoping for a reunion for years, but Eric flatly refused. Whenever Ginger was involved, he called Baker a loose cannon and a nightmare in human form. When they did perform together briefly in 2005, insiders said it was all business, with no laughter or warmth. They were just putting up with each other for nostalgia's sake. After the fact, Baker, who never liked being quiet, said, "Eric was scared of me because he knew I was the better musician." Clapton never responded to that slur in public, but insiders say it made things worse between them. Their partnership had created something legendary, but at the cost of a relationship so toxic that it could not be fixed. Eric met Frank Zappa, who not only disagreed with him but also made fun of everything he stood for. War of the Weirdos. Eric Clapton was the high priest of the blues rock tradition, and Frank Zappa was the heretic who came to burn down the temple. Zappa loved breaking musical rules. He was experimental, provocative, and straight-up weird. In a harsh interview in 1978, Zappa said that Clapton's love of the blues wasn't art, it was boredom. Eric Clapton is a safe guitar player, there's no danger in his art. That wasn't just criticism, it was an insult to Clapton's soul. Eric was already tired of critics who questioned his worth, and he was so angry that he reportedly told a friend, "Frank Zappa's music is just noise wrapped in ego, none of it means anything." But this verbal battle wasn't new, they had been angry with each other for almost a decade. At the 1969 Love and Peace Festival, Zappa allegedly demanded to play right before Clapton, knowing that Clapton's experimental and chaotic set would be hard to follow. "Let's see him go on after that," Zappa said. With a smirk, Zappa told the crew that Clapton, who was angry but smart, didn't take the bait in public but grew angry with him behind closed doors. Clapton thought Zappa's music was purposely confusing and more of a parody of musicianship than a product of it, but Zappa kept poking the bear. In interviews, he called Clapton's solos pentatonic exercises, and said he'd been using the same licks for 10 years. Clapton called Zappa unlistenable and said no one he respected liked his music, but there was a deeper disagreement beneath the jabs. Clapton believed in tradition, emotion, and the rawness of the blues. Zappa, on the other hand, believed in pushing boundaries, breaking down structures, and reprogramming music completely. Their fight wasn't just personal, it was a microcosm of rock's battle between roots and rebellion. Not long after Zappa's death in 1993, Clapton reportedly told a close friend, "I have nothing to say about him that wouldn't be inappropriate." A cold ending to a feud that had never heated up, but if Zappa's challenges went deep, the next one would cut through Clapton's personal life and leave scars he couldn't hide. Keith Richards' Betrayal in the Bloodstream. This one had it all: ego, betrayal, and a woman who broke more than just a friendship. Keith Richards and Eric Clapton were never close, but things went crazy when Clapton did something that not even the craziest rock stars could handle. He went after and stole Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. Richards wasn't just shocked, he was furious. He publicly questioned Clapton's morals and his loyalty to Keith. It wasn't just about love, it was about honor among friends, and in his eyes, Clapton had broken the code. The musical tension wasn't far behind Clapton, who was a blues purist and thought Richards' raw style was sloppy and unfocused. He is said to have called Keith's guitar work lazy and a mess. In interviews, Richards hit back, calling Clapton predictable, dull, and way too popular. Then the derugs happened. In the 1970s, both men were deeply addicted to drugs, but instead of coming together to deal with their problems, they turned on each other. Richards accused Clapton of using heroin as a shield, saying things like, "Eric hides behind drugs." Clapton, not one to take it lying down, quietly snapped back, "Keith's been playing the same 5 riffs for 20 years. At one point, things got so bad that social events had to be split into 2 camps, one with Clapton and one with Richards. Promoters and producers quietly made sure they weren't booked on the same festivals. There wasn't just tension, there was real hatred that went beyond small offenses. Clapton thought Richards was too polished and planned out, while Richards thought Clapton was a mess who wasn't disciplined and was overrated. Their rivalry was brutal, long-lasting, and deeply personal, with roots in both betrayal and pride. The two legends would always circle each other with clenched jaws and cold silence. But if that feud was based on betrayal and ego, the next one was based on something even darker, the paralyzing fear of being replaced. Jimmy Page, the crown that he couldn't get back. Eric Clapton used to be Britain's untouchable guitar god, praised as God by both graffiti artists and fans. But then Jimmy Page came along with his dark, mysterious violin bows and thunderous riffs and burned his throne to the ground. Page redefined what it meant to be a guitar hero. Led Zeppelin wasn't just a band, it was a mythological force, and Clapton, he suddenly looked dated, obsolete, left behind in private. The jealousy simmered. One studio engineer remembered Clapton sneering during a playback session, "Jimmy hides behind studio tricks, let's see him do that live." But Page could do it live, and then some. Zeppelin's albums dominated the charts, their tours sold out arenas around the world, and as their legacy exploded, Clapton reportedly refused to read any article that compared the two. He knew the truth deep down. The crown had shifted. Former Yardbirds bandmate Paul Samuel Smith summed it up with a brutal dose of reality. Jimmy took the band Eric abandoned and made it legendary. That haunted Eric. The wound never truly healed. In later interviews, Clapton said that Page's sound was clever with effects but lacked soul. Page responded with a shrug and called Clapton an old man stuck in the past. This wasn't just a clash of styles, it was a fight for rock immortality. One stuck to the old blues world, while the other broke new ground. Clapton felt more and more overshadowed as Page rose in the rock world. It wasn't just a competition, it became an obsession, a reminder that the man who was once known as God could be surpassed. But the final rivalry that won didn't just shake Clapton's confidence, it destroyed his very sense of who he was. Jimi Hendrix. On an electric night in 1966, Eric Clapton lost his throne, and he was never the same again. He walked into a smoky London club as the king of British guitarists. He had the swagger, the fame, and the revered nickname, God. But then, Jimi Hendrix came on stage and changed the rules of the guitar in a single set. Clapton stood there stunned as Hendrix tore through his set, playing behind him with his teeth, lighting the strings on fire, both figuratively and literally. Eric said to a friend, "It's over, I'm done." A witness said he left halfway through, looking pale and shaky. The man who was known for his slow, soulful bends had just seen the future of music, and it was louder, faster, and unapologetically wild. Clapton had built his world on blues, but Hendrix made it seem old-fashioned behind closed doors. Eric became obsessed with Jimmy's licks and tried to copy his tones and stage presence. But when he was in public, he changed his tone and called Hendrix's brilliance overindulgent noise. Later, another great guitar player named Pete Townshend made it clear. Eric couldn't handle losing the throne, and he didn't go to any of Hendrix's concerts anymore. Clapton's friends told him he'd switch radio stations if Jimmy came on. It wasn't just a rivalry, it was a crisis. Jimmy died suddenly in 1970, and fans all over the world mourned. Clapton, on the other hand, said nothing, no tribute, no comment, and stayed silent. Years later, in a rare moment of honesty, he admitted what no one expected. "I felt relieved. The feud had never been verbal, there were no interviews, no diss tracks, but the damage was deeper than any headline." Hendrix not only beat Clapton, but he also destroyed the very identity that Eric had built his career on. Even after Hendrix left, the shadow he cast over Clapton never went away, because sometimes the most painful rivalries are the ones where your worst enemy never hated you back. These weren't just rivalries, they were reflections of Clapton himself, his insecurities, his pride, and his drive to be great. Each fight tore down the myth of the untouchable guitar god and showed the proud, hurt, and often at odds with his own legend man underneath. Because in the end, the best solos come from pain, and Clapton's pain was written not only in lyrics but also in broken friendships, angry words, and music that still echoes with unfinished business.